went to a number of universities here on the West Coast. I bounced around a while, finally got an undergraduate degree at University of Idaho. And then I went to graduate school at Cornell, and then went to Manhattan to start my career. Spent 6 years there, working for a variety of different architects in a variety of different sizes of firms, from Stephen Hall when he was in a broken down studio on West 20th Street without any bathrooms, to working with Philip Johnson up in Midtown. And then I moved to San Francisco, practiced a few years there on a number of projects in Silicon Valley. I had the fortune of working on a international trade center in Osaka. And then I really wanted to get back to the desert and wanted to be in an environment like where I grew up, which was a small little town. So I somehow ended up here in New Mexico, specifically Santa Fe, and spent the first 5 years working for another firm, and then in '96 went out on my own. My primary interest and work has been in custom residential, but I have done a number of limited amount of commercial projects. This one here, the Chapel of Light in Santa Fe, in southern part of Santa Fe, is near and dear to my heart. I started in 2007 was when the client initially came to me, and we finally finished last year. So it's been a long haul, but it's been great. I've really loved it. And hopefully I can explain why. So in general terms, today I'd like to talk to you about death. Most of my custom residential projects, as interesting as they are, they really don't carry a lot of weight. And this non-denominational chapel did, and I had to deal with, it's associated with the Rivera Funeral Home and Cemetery, and this is a aerial of the existing layout. And this area here was where we had, the only place we could place the chapel. Right now, that little building previous to this work was a very, very small, poorly laid out chapel. So this is an aerial or a composite of what we ended up doing. And so the charge that I was given from the client was, in lieu of what we might traditionally think of as funerals, there's really been a move nationally, if not internationally, to change that dynamic to life celebration. And it's more than a semantically being politically correct. They really do, the whole idea is not to have a sort of depressing ceremony, but rather celebrate the person's life and have a lighter sort of more upbeat character to the services. And indeed, some of these chapels around the country are not only having funeral services or life celebrations, people are having baptisms and weddings and a variety of different activities in the building. So this is a floor plan of the building. On the far right is an existing structure that we had to add on to. So this technically was an addition renovation, and the main effort was, of course, the chapel, and then left and right we have some support space. On this side over here is an entrance lobby, columbariums on each side. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the term is where they inter ashes. They're going to do the same out here on these walls out on in the landscape. And as an aside, body burials are really going by the wayside, and almost everyone is going with cremation. And the reality is that large cemetery is virtually full. So in order to accommodate the ashes of the deceased, they've created these columbariums to place them there. And then on the right here, this is all new. That's all support space for the main event of the chapel. So what I took on with this project from what the client wanted to do is I decided to try and do something really simple. And simple is not easy, I can tell you that. And that really plays into what I'd like to discuss with you guys today as far as building systems, and that is how do you integrate those building systems into a typical work of architecture, but more importantly, how do you do it when you're dealing with a very simple, lean space? What I was attempting to do with this circular room is that I first of all came up with the round room because the circle has such cross-cultural significance around the globe. You find it in just about every culture. And I really did want to kind of look back on ancient cultures as some influence. This is the elevation that faces the cemetery. It's essentially a cylindrical shape, more cone-like because the walls batter out. And this is an elevation of the west, or the east side, excuse me. What I generally wanted to mention is, or discuss, is really how architecture can be created and still accommodate all of the functional necessities of the building. And this building section is fairly key, which I'll explain in a minute, but in general terms, I remember a quote from David Lean, one of the great directors from the 40s to the 70s. He said that making movies is like threading a needle in a sandstorm, in that he had a vision of what he wanted to see on the screen that would move people and really touch their heart. And yet he had all this crap to deal with. He had the actors, the site, the weather, the writers, the music, all of the stuff that made up the film, and yet he had to somehow coalesce all of that stuff into one image that ended up on the screen and hopefully impacted us, the audience. And I see that very similar in what we were trying to do, and what we always try to do in our work is to create something that is above and beyond just function. I think it was Rem Koolhaas who said that architecture isn't about the site, isn't about the budget, isn't about the client, it isn't about, a number of things. It's about something else that rises up above that. And so that's been my focus. I can't stand here and tell you I'm a building systems expert. It's quite the opposite. My focus is entirely on design. But in order for that focus of design to succeed, you've really got to make everything else work out. So this section here, I'll probably show you a number of times, but in essence, I wanted the building to seem like it was a straight cylinder and just was battered out as if it's opening up to the heavens. And the only way, since it's a non-denominational chapel, it's sort of like a theatrical black box. And so the idea was to try and imbue a sense of sacredness through natural light and artificial light. And then, depending on each service, the relatives could bring in icons of whatever religion they may or may not have to augment that. The round space can accommodate a wide variety of seating arrangements depending on the number of folks showing up and how they want to lay it out. I kind of stole some of these ideas from Mario Boda. You'll find that I steal a lot of ideas from a lot of people. But when I worked for Philip Johnson, he said, everything's been done. So if you're going to steal ideas from the really good people. So I'll just show you a few photographs. This is the exterior from the southwest side with the cemetery in front of it. These stone-faced columbariums are really where the ashes will be eventually be placed. That's a straight-on elevation from the west. The orientation of the building is along the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west. This is another view. This is the east side here, which I came up with this idea. We had a problem in that we had a very constrained space, as you may recall from the site plan that I showed you. And technically, the occupancy of the building did not require fire suppression, but the road to it through the cemetery was only 12 feet wide. So I had to meet with the county fire marshal and try and work out a compromise. And since we had grave sites right next to the road, we really couldn't widen it. So he said, okay, I can live with the 12-foot width for the fire truck, but you have to sprinkle the building, even though we didn't need to, but we accepted that compromise. But then as there's a loop around the chapel, and on the east side right here, he wanted a 16-foot width, and we could accommodate it down here at the ground. But since the building battered out, as the building batters out, it lessens that 16 foot. And they also wanted 16 feet vertically, so like a 16-foot box through which the fire truck could run. And obviously, fire trucks aren't 16 feet high or 16 feet wide, but that's just the nature of the code. So I thought, well, why don't I just cut a section out of the cylinder and accommodate that 16-foot height? And it actually made for a kind of an interesting character to the elevation of that east side. So we ended up cutting sort of a wedge out of it, and it actually, I think, enhanced that elevation. So that's one aspect of taking code and fire requirements and really imbuing some more interest into the design of the building, simply accommodating the code. This is in the interior, and I should say that everybody who's seen this space, photographs just don't do it. You have to experience the space, and I do think that's true. That round room is very difficult to photograph, and it's very difficult to represent two-dimensionally within that space. But people really love it. It's really gotten a great reception. But in essence, what the design idea I had was, number one, I wanted to keep the number of light fixtures to an absolute minimum. I prefer none. There are a couple that you can see, like underneath this arch here, and a couple other spots. I did have to live with an exit sign on two sides. You know, there's a fire alarm that I had to have on the exposed wall, but I really wanted it to be an absolute minimum feel on the interior, and that through natural light and artificial light would be, as I said before, a way to sort of create some real interest. The center there is an ornamental metal piece that floats down below a round skylight. So that's really the only ornament, if you will, in the space. And that's about 12 feet wide. It's about 18 inches deep. And it's made from really one piece of metal. That curve and that height, everything is made, other than the perimeter that goes around the outside, those all are what make up that flower of life. So it's an interesting geometry that we kind of stumbled upon, And what I liked about it was that it's like the circle itself is cross-cultural, and it's found, that form has been found in buildings 2000 BC, that same diagram, and it's seen in art over the centuries. There's a sarcophagus with that pattern on the top of it. This bronze piece from the Bronze Age. From India, they created it around a circular form. This is in a cathedral in Europe. Leonardo da Vinci played around with the idea. So it's just those, the flower of life gives a sense of optimism, I think. It's hanging up in the sky. The skylight will cast interesting light through it throughout the year. So the other piece of ornament is a piece of onyx in dead center in the chapel, on top of which they can, they've got a little onyx platform that they can put right on top of it and place the ashes there with oil lamps around it during the ceremony. And so this pattern of the flower of life we extended to ornamenting the doors. So this is on the doors on the north, south, and east side. And then this is called the seed of life, which is just a portion of the flower of life in total. The other aspect that I picked up on, which obviously is really ancient, is and that is the solstice, the winter solstice and the summer solstice. And I wanted to mark those two simply to somehow link to the natural environment. And so this window here is the winter solstice. At sunrise, it hits a circular nicho, and then as the sun ascends, it comes across and hits the center of the room later in the day. And the same thing happens with the summer solstice window. But the thing is, I had to place those windows in such a way that I had to work around the structure. So it was kind of a hit and miss. I was hoping that we would be okay. I didn't want to have to change the structural system. So this is where the summer solstice, or excuse me, the winter solstice window is placed, and it's very close to the structure that we had to respect. But fortunately, it turned out okay. This is a photograph. I was there last June 22nd and got up early in the morning and waited for the sun to come up and shoot through that window, and then I marked where it was on the opposite wall and marked it with pencil, and then they created a nicho in it. And those two windows have iridescent film on them, and so depending on the time of day and the time of year, it creates a variety of different characteristics. And it's really, obviously, most ceremonies aren't going to happen on the solstice, and most people aren't going to be there early in the morning in either of those two dates. But the story is what's compelling, and the owner tells that story to potential clients, and they really love it. Those are the only two windows in the building, in the chapel itself, and in the one skylight. We have a side building, or a side room that is for visitation. So when the ashes of the body is placed at the end of this room below this kind of decorative wall, it's there that the room can be filled with chairs or whatever, and they can visit the body. There's some religions where family members can't be away from the body from death until burial, and so this room is to accommodate that. And sometimes they have quite active celebrations in there. They bring food, they bring, candles, whatever they want to bring. One aspect, this is sort of outside building systems, but I wanted to have a sense of entry, and so this upside down cone, the front entry, the idea was to have a segmented arc kind of slide right through that form. And I wanted that arc to sort of, the center of the arc to be below the ground. It's an idea I took from Boulay, an entrance to a funeral, or a cemetery that he designed back in the 1700s. One thing about systems, though, is that we ended up with these speakers mounted on the exterior. These are light fixtures that shoot up at night. The speakers weren't great. They initially were black, which was terrible. But then I insisted that they get white. But hindsight being 20/20, I would have preferred placing those speakers somewhere else or somehow being flush to the building. So that was a little unfortunate. And then the lighting was really critical, and it hasn't turned out as ideally as I would want. That's sort of the effect at night. I was hoping for a wider spread, which I think hopefully with different lamps and such we might be able to achieve. And the stucco job could have been better, but I'm getting comfortable with it sort of looking funky. So it's this form that was rather taxing for the contractor to build, but it had a certain sculptural quality to it that I kind of liked, and sort of went to the mat and trying to get it right. This was their first attempt, and all of that is totally wrong. So they had to rip it out and do it again. And they couldn't quite get it, so we built them a model and tried to show however crudely, the way it should really be constructed. And it extends into the chapel as well. So it did end up fairly accurate. I actually, is this the right slide? Yeah. This link where this massing comes and hits the main massing of the chapel, slides underneath it. That point was really critical, and they still got it wrong. It's still about 2 inches off, so I photoshopped it. The other thing that I kind of regret is the structure. These really long 24-foot steel studs were really quite elegant and beautiful, and part of me wishes that somehow we could have left them exposed instead of covering them up with stucco, because there was a play of light and shadow on it that was quite nice. The reason that the walls are 7 foot thick is because we had a real tight budget, and so we had to create a structural system that was very, very simple. So the idea was simply to have simple columns and really basic segmented beams carrying most of the weight. But in order to do that, I still wanted that battered wall. So if the column started here at the ground and went straight up, then, and I wanted that batter, the only way I could make that work is to create a very deep, thick wall, which was fine with me because that's a gesture to, you know, the vernacular architecture of New Mexico of thick adobe walls. So we have this thick plenum space that is kind of fairly interesting, but there's that steel column going up, and then the two walls left and right that are furred out. The other thing that I employed was I stole an idea from James Turrell and his sky spaces that he creates, and these rings in the ceiling have a very knife-like edge right here and right there, so that in the back are concealed strip lights, and it kind of has a nice effect when the edge or the thickness of the ceiling is almost literally gone away. So this is where we've created a piece of wood that comes right down to a knife edge here and up here, and then the lights are back here and back here. So I don't know, it has sort of an ethereal quality to it. This is an image of after the framer went insane, but he actually finished putting up those two rings and tapered each one of those 2x down to a knife edge. From the standpoint of plumbing, I guess all you guys know, the first rule of plumbing is that shit goes downhill. Well, we were in a situation where the restrooms here in the chapel were below, the landscape naturally dropped from south to north, and the street is way out here to the right where the sewer line is. So we had to use a lift station or a grinder pump in order to pull the sewage in the opposite direction it wanted to go. So that proved to be somewhat complicating. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, is that we had to sprinkle the building, and so this was the layout the engineer created with our collaboration. And so we had to have sprinkler heads on those rings up at the very top and around the perimeter. But again, my attempt to have it absolutely as simple as possible was a real concern. And what we decided to do was get this, recess the sprinkler head, have a cap over the top of the sprinkler head. Unlike the ones that are in here where you can actually see them, this had a flat cap, and they typically come in white, but we had a custom color done because you can't paint it. If you paint it, it's heat sensitive, so if there's a fire, the cap senses the heat, falls off, and then the sprinklers take off. So if you paint it, then the cap won't heat up and it won't work. So we did a custom color, and it does, here's one, here's another. It does fade away fairly nicely. So I was fairly pleased with that. I recently stayed in the Mondrian Hotel in New York City. I was laying in bed, looked up and saw that the sprinkler head had been painted purple. So I alerted the management. Hopefully they changed it. Another thing that I wanted to discuss was acoustics. This is a round room. We brought on some acoustic consultants, and they said we were kind of crazy, that in a round room we would get all kinds of echoes and strange sound, depending on where the speaker would be, depending on how many people were in it. They suggested we went round and round about how to treat it acoustically. I didn't want to put any sort of panels up in the ceiling or on the walls. Again, trying to keep it absolutely simple. And so we fairly seriously considered acoustic plaster. It's a product that has like a bat insulation, has a backing, and then on the face of it is a finished plaster that is somewhat porous, and so the sound transfers into that bat and absorbs the sound. But it was $150,000 to do it just on the ceiling, and I think another $100,000 to do it on the walls. We just didn't have the money, and so the owner decided, well, let's build it and see what happens when the whole structure is we've got all the walls and ceilings up and everything. And I talked to another architect who had acoustical concerns on a project, and he said, we just didn't do anything. And that's what we ended up doing here. This is a photograph of the opening on October 20th, I think, and it works fine. We were very, very pleased. They predicted we would have 2.5 to 3 second delays depending on where you're at, which would have been horrible, and it actually works quite well. The only thing that you notice is if you stand right in the center and talk, you get this strange, weird sound, and only you get it. People standing off the side do not. So we were nervous there for a while because we thought it would be a real premium, and I couldn't figure out how to keep it simple. But fortunately, we were able to do the walls in regular plaster. The ceiling is sheetrock with paint, level 4 paint finish, and it ended up working. The other thing that I wanted to discuss was the ossuaries around the perimeter. You may not be familiar with the term, but it's quite ancient. It's a tradition of having an opening in the floor that's covered in a church where in the old days it was just bones put there, but then later ashes were interred. And so that was the idea of using the perimeter, 3-foot perimeter wall to place all of the primary constellations that are right at the equator, which are the main ones that we all know, plus the 4 major elements: water, fire, earth, and wind. We threw in the DNA helix and the infinity sign. And so we made those out of 2-foot wide granite pieces and then inlaid stainless steel to show each of the constellation forms. And so we really did it not so much from an astrological standpoint or as astrology, but rather somehow trying to bring the idea of the heavens down into the space. However, when they cut those holes in the concrete at the very, very early stages before any walls or anything went up, and the circles ended up being off. Some were accurate, some were shifted like 6 or 8 inches, and it was already cut into the concrete. We are still dealing with that problem today. And the plan, what's there now is polished concrete, so you can't do much with polished concrete. But so we thought of tile, we thought of vinyl. We finally found a material that we think might work, which is a very thin concrete topping. It's cementitious, there's no aggregate, and it'll float, it'll go on literally like a liquid and just almost be self-leveling. And we can fix the damn ossuaries that they put in the wrong location, put them in the right location, and then put this finish on it. So I think we're almost there, but we're still dealing with it. And so the project in some respects still isn't over. I wanted the walls around the perimeter to be really simple, as mentioned before. Sorry to be redundant, it's obviously a simple space. But how do you do HVAC? How do you do supply air and return? We came up with the idea of allowing the bottom, as the wall comes down, allowing the bottom of the wall to float about 6 or 8 inches, and then recess back from it supply ducts around the perimeter. And then we, up behind the rings, we would have a few registers that are return air. And it turned out fairly well. This is an image of the roof. I took a portion of that support space and dropped the ceiling as much as I could. There was a garage here and storage. What I absolutely hate is a really nice building, and then you look on top of it and there's the mechanical system sitting, the unit sitting up on the roof, which just looks terrible. So I dropped the ceiling in there so that these big rooftop units could be concealed. And then we ran the ducting over this foyer space into that 7-foot thick plenum that we had that we could utilize, and then all the air was distributed through that plenum and dropped down to the floor in that slot. So up here are return air grills that are concealed because of the drop ceiling. Here's the supply ducting, and then we had secondary ducting coming down to this box, and then from that box were a number of round supply duct openings, but what you see is simply a black slot right around the base of the building, all the way around the 4 sides. So it's pretty inconspicuous. One problem I ran into was that of the 4 quadrants, we only needed 3 quadrants of supply, and the 4th one was just a dummy. But I still wanted that slot, obviously. I still wanted that slot diffuser to complete the whole circle, but they didn't price that in, so we had to get a new one. We had to debate about a change order, and that was somewhat problematic and kind of a pain. But This is an image of looking at some of the finishes. This is the carpet in the middle of the space. That's the polished concrete that's sealed. This was a vinyl that we considered, which we rejected. But that's the slot there, which is nice and clean, and I thought it worked out fairly decently. That roof plan that I showed you, here's that duct coming through the parapet, down and over and into the chapel proper, the plenum space of the perimeter wall. But then I went out to the site, and look at that. It was what I neglected to factor in was the elevation is such that the parapet of the foyer is lower than the parapet of the garage and storage. And so when that portion right there ended up being exposed. So I just added a stucco wall and surrounded it. So that's that piece there. It's not ideal. I wish I could have figured something else out, but that's all we could do. So it was a compromise, but not too bad of a compromise. Along the lines of electrical systems, I thought I would show you this photograph. The floor, much of the floor in the chapel is, as mentioned, is polished concrete, but we had the big damn black 8-inch square access floor panel for outlets and microphone connection. So there's a really good painter in Santa Fe, and he does faux painting, and so he faux painted it. And I thought he did a fabulous job. I just love it. The big issue was light, and that perimeter lighting around the chapel. This is in the visitation room. I think it works pretty darn well. But in the chapel, it was made up of segments. The fixture were segments, and this is all ribbon light, all LED. When they went all the way around the chapel, they ended up having like 18 inches short. And it created a bit of a shadow right here. And these are all movable. You can rotate them and set where the light hits the wall. And I wanted the light to go all the way down the wall and wash it very subtly. And it's still not ideal. It works fairly well. We're actually considering, I'm bringing in a lighting consultant from Telluride who specializes in residential, but we may end up changing these fixtures if I can find something that works better than what this does. And I stole this idea, as I mentioned, from James Terrell. These are images from his installation at the Guggenheim. And I don't know if you know about his work, but if you don't, check it out. He does these beautiful sky spaces, which are simply holes in rooms that open to the sky. And he does that knife edge around the perimeter, and it really brings the sky right down to you. In this instance, in the internal primary lobby of the Guggenheim, he used these rings, various rings, and put light, RGB light, which we have at the chapel, you know, red, green, blue, and so it very gradually changes color over a period of time. And, you know, people they would even lay on the floor. My bookkeeper went and saw it. I didn't see it in person, my bookkeeper did. When she came back, she explained it, and she was in tears. It was so moving. At Rice University, he just finished another cool sky space that looks rather intriguing. I just threw this image in because I'm a huge fan of Louis Kahn, and it kind of, it's the epitome of planning ahead and planning for all the different systems that you have to accommodate into a building. This is the Phillips Exeter Library. Now what blows me away is that right there. But they had to plan the floor, they had to plan the slab, the floor slab of the second floor, not only to accommodate the fluorescent lighting, but also accommodate the ducting, the supply and return. And it's just elegant. ducting. It's just beautiful stuff. And the mixture of materials, you know, Con said architecture begins at the joint, and you have to really consider that joint very closely. And how he handled the wood, to brick, to concrete, then to the fixture, then to the stainless steel ducting. It's just elegant. It's just so nicely resolved. And that takes so much work when you're in the early design stages to think about how you accommodate the building systems. And of course, Con was big on really celebrating service and served space. And I think in one of his labs, it might have been the Salk Institute, vertically, they've got the labs, and then they've got a huge plenum that you can actually walk in to modify all of the supply air, ducting, and pipes and electrical that the scientists need to work on. So I just really enjoyed that image. I just thought I would throw it in. So at the end of the day, this is an ink wash I did early on, very early in the process, and I'm fairly pleased with it. It turned out pretty close to the way we wanted. We had just this little bit of ornament in the skylight. The forms and the massing are fairly simple. You know, it's wall-dominated architecture like the traditional Spanish Pueblo Revival style architecture. I consciously did the chapel in this Navajo white, it's called, kind of an off-white color to accentuate it. It's not very high. We had to push it down into the ground to appease the neighbors because there was a residential district on 3 sides of this property. But all in all, through careful collaboration with all of the engineers, we managed to do the mechanical system fairly well. The plumbing works quite well. The electrical is fine. The lighting I'm still dealing with and hopefully can improve upon it. But when you're in the space, you don't think about all of those aspects, and I think that's what is a sign that it succeeded, that when people come in, they're there to address those huge issues of life and death and do it in a space that is accommodating for that function. So that's all I have to say. I don't know how I am on time. I never did a test run or anything. I just threw this thing together.
Perfect timing. Questions? Way back there, Jed.
I noticed on your electrical plates and the floors that it looks like the artist who painted them, some of them are getting scuffed up and starting to turn black again. How do you anticipate taking care of that issue?
They are getting, scuffed up?
Yes, sir.
I didn't know that.
On the edges there.
Well, that's a gap down through the plate, but I think the main point, I think, is that paint is not going to last as long as the polished concrete. And so we'll probably have to redo it after a period of time.
Alex.
Did you anticipate the space between that plenum area for mechanical systems while you were designing, or is that just going to be so?
Well, as mentioned, that thick wall came about. Well, first of all, I wanted the wall battered out, and I initially worked with a structural engineer to have angled structure. The structure itself would also be angled, so we had a thin wall, but it was battered, but it's really expensive. The moment connection at the ground with that angled column was huge. We had just gigantic footings, and so the idea occurred to me to just allow that column to be dead on straight but I still wanted the batter, and the batter ended up being a 7-foot thick wall. But as soon as we did it, we realized, hell, we can use that not only for mechanical, but it's used as secondary storage. So a lot of the back of house stuff, the AV stuff is put in those spaces. So we very quickly recognized that that would be a logical place to run all the HVAC.
Any questions? Did you have any ideas about how the roof would be treated, or was that not necessarily part of the project?
As far as the surface that the material that we used,
Material under slope, or?
we knew we wanted to stay flat. There was a big debate as to whether we used a built-up roof, you know, with the tar and the bitumen and a standard roof that you see all the time. But then we also explored TPO, which I can't remember what TPO means, but it's, you know, it's a petroleum-based thick sheet material that's heat welded together, and that's what we ended up using. And it'll last 30, 40 years, maybe 50 years. It'll last forever, virtually. They come in various thicknesses. I think we did 3 mil, and we should be good for quite a while.
Is there a particular way that you sort of designed or planned for the water to drain off the roof then?
From the chapel, we kind of divided it in two and allowed it to slope 1/4 inch per foot to the north and south side, and there are internal drains.
Oh.
So there's no exposed drainage. There's internal drains, and then, you know, there's a cowlip drain at the bottom of the outside wall in 2 locations. So it's fairly inconspicuous. We did have some active canales on the secondary spaces, but for the most part, it was through internal drains. I prefer using internal drains on our residential projects too. We do more contemporary residential work, so the traditional canale is not really in keeping with the character of designs that we generate.
Other questions?
I'm crazy busy. I've got
Good.
I've got 10 or 11 projects, but this was actually very enjoyable to try and kind of put some slides together and come down here and talk to you guys. It's kind of a nice break, even though I'm working 7 days a week. It's enjoyable to sort of be in this environment. It's so rare. I'm just usually just sitting at my desk or a computer and just working away. But we have some pretty cool projects coming up that are pretty exciting. We're working regionally around the country, so.
Could you tell us a little bit about your office and sort of how you structure or work? Or
I've always kept a small office. I only have 2 full-time people, 2 architects that work with me, and then 1 other guy who used to work for me. He's kind of available on the side if we end up needing help. He's sort of semi-retired in his mid-60s. All of my employees are very good at technical drawing, but also very good design eye. Design is critical. Hopefully, in my talk, threaded through it is that the focus is always on design, no matter whether you're talking about, you know, a return air grill or you know, plumbing fixtures. It's all about the design and how it informs and supports the design. So in my employees, I want them to be really good designers. I still am old school. I draw manually. I don't know how to work on a computer. So I draw very meticulous floor plans and exterior elevations, and then I hand it off to staff. Those 2 guys put it into Revit. We do kind of a hybrid of Revit and AutoCAD drawings. Some of the drawings you saw here were AutoCAD. When we get into building sections, it seems like AutoCAD is a little more straightforward and easier. I hate the graphics in Revit. You have to work at it a fair amount to make it look nice and clean. not to cast aspersions on a whole nother profession, but engineers' drawings are terrible. God, they're terrible. Because the line weights are, there's no hierarchy of line weight. I just don't understand why they don't step up to the plate and do beautiful drawings. When I started out in New York, and back then, everybody was manual, it was a work of art. The working drawings, there was an elegance to it, and people really, my people I work for insisted on really accurate line weight, and the drawings pop. You can read them, you can see them instantly, the information. You don't have to look at the various line weights to think, well, is that a surface that's in front of you and back behind it? It's the same line weight, and everything is so flat and boring. But I've always kept a small office. I've had more employees. I'm so busy right now. I think about maybe hiring, but as I hire more people, I start to lose control. Not that I am the sole author of the design, but there are certain aspects of the projects that I want to see executed right. And the more people I brought on in the past, the more I lose that control and things start to slip. And so it's a constant debate within myself as to how large the office should be, how much work I should take on. I'm very busy right now. I've always been busy. 6 months or 9 months or a year down the road, it's a black hole. And I'm absolutely convinced I will never get another project. And so I'm very hesitant of turning work down. And so sometimes I'm my own worst enemy. I should have the confidence that yes, the work will come in, turn down work. But I have turned down work. I thought, when I started my own office in '96, I thought one sign of a successful practice is to turn away work. And some clients are not the nicest clients in the world, and I've turned down work. I've fired clients too. I fired a couple clients, which was enjoyable.
End that relationship early. Other questions? The light is truly one spectacular aspect of the project. I'm so thrilled to see your attention and continued attention to the quality of it. It really becomes the synthesis of a technical as well as a constructed narrative, like you said earlier.
Right. And Kahn is my big hero, and he was all about light. And that's what I closely look at in our residential projects also. But this project was particularly of interest because dealing with those big issues and applying so much weight to the natural and artificial light that it was a real challenge. So that's that aspect of, Kahn said, light is a form-defining element, and I think of that all the time in all of the projects we do. We do a lot of skylights and clerestories, but not skylights that are simply a 2x2 skylight in the middle of the room. We tend to shove it up against the wall or make it an interesting form or have, perforated metal to create interesting shadows through it. It's all about light, sort of like photography. It's all about the light. And I should say, honestly, if any of you guys are up in Santa Fe and you'd like to see the chapel, I'd be happy to show it to you, because these slides don't begin to give it justice. And I put it in the AIA Santa Fe Awards and managed to get an award from it and Rick Joy was on the jury. I put it in the Jeff Harner Awards. Rick Joy was on that jury. And he said, doesn't quite cut it. But I'm okay with that, because it just, no matter what I put together in a PowerPoint, it really doesn't give you the sense of the space unless you actually experience it. So please, if you're up there, whether I'm around or you can just drop by there, it's on Rodeo Road. If they're not having a service, you're welcome to walk through it. Just tell them you're about to die and that you need to have
a narrative.
They'll show you around.
That's right. Great. Any other questions? Well, thank you so very much. Great. And we do have a copy of his PowerPoint, so thank you for including the drawings in it as well.
Sure,
That-
yeah.
That was really